Danger might be closer than you think. Before we begin, like this video, comment where and what time you're watching from, and subscribe for more chilling stories. Now turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's dive into the unknown. Story 1. When I rented that apartment, I thought I had struck a great deal. It was small but cheap, and located in the city center close to my job. The building was old, with narrow hallways and creaky wooden floors that groaned with every step. The landlord was a bit of an odd character, spoke little and always seemed in a hurry. When he handed me the keys, he casually mentioned that there was a little room at the end of the hallway, just for building storage, and that tenants were not allowed to tamper with it. I thought nothing of it. Old buildings usually have storage areas, and honestly, I didn't give it a second thought. But after a few nights there, I began to notice strange noises coming from that hallway. It was always late at night when the building was already silent. Faint sounds, like something light moving or a whispered voice, impossible to make out. At first I thought it was just plumbing or something in my head, but over time the noises became more frequent. That night it all started with a power outage. It was quick, about 10 seconds, but enough to send a chill down my spine. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when everything went dark. The hallway was completely black. When the lights came back on, I realized something that made me freeze. The storage room door was slightly ajar. I was absolutely sure it had always been locked. I stared at it for a few seconds, feeling a chill creep up my neck. I tried to convince myself that maybe someone from the building had passed by and left it open before the blackout. But then it hit me. No one ever touched that door. I decided to get up and go over there. My heart started pounding as I got closer. The more I walked down the hallway, the more I had this irrational feeling that someone was on the other side of that door, standing there, listening. When I reached the door, I hesitated. I can't explain it, but something felt off. The smell in the hallway was different. A musty scent mixed with something sour like damp old wood. I touched the door and it felt cold, much colder than it should have been. The gap between the door and the frame was small, but enough to see pure darkness on the other side. I took a deep breath and pushed the door slowly, expecting it to be stuck, but it opened far too easily, without a creak, as if it had been like that for a long time. Inside, I didn't see much at first. It was a small, dark room with some shelves and old boxes stacked up, but there was something wrong. The floor was covered in a kind of dust or dark soot, and in the corner, a very dirty mattress, as if someone had slept there for years. That's when I felt real fear, not because of the temperature, but because a primal instinct was telling me I shouldn't be there. Before I could react, a dry sound came from inside the room, like a thud, a hollow noise against the wood. My blood ran cold. I froze for a second, my eyes glued to the darkness, trying to figure out where it came from. My first thought was that something had fallen off one of the shelves, but nothing seemed out of place. The mattress was still there, unmoved, and the boxes were stacked the same way. Then I smelled something strong, a mix of old dust and something sour, almost like aged sweat. And then, in the darkest corner of the room, I saw a slight movement, as if something had shrunk back further into the darkness. My body reacted before my mind processed it. I took 2 steps back, my chest tight, and without thinking, I pulled the door shut with force. At that instant, from the other side of the door, something or someone pushed back. The impact was weak, but enough for me to feel the pressure against the door. My heart raced in a way I'd never felt before. I gripped the doorknob tightly, not even knowing why, as if I was preventing something from getting out. My ears were sharp, waiting for any sound from the other side, but nothing came. No footsteps, no breathing, just a heavy silence, almost forced. My mind tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just an air shift, maybe a box had slid and hit the door. But then why did I still feel that absurd sensation of being watched? I swallowed hard, and without letting go of the doorknob, I took a step back. That's when the door moved on its own, slowly, as if someone had placed their hand on the doorknob on the other side, testing if I was still there. I didn't wait any longer. I quickly walked back to my apartment and locked the door behind me. My chest was rising and falling, my head spinning. I grabbed my phone to call the landlord, but stopped midway. What was I going to say? that the door that should have been locked opened on its own, that something was inside but I didn't see anyone. He'd probably laugh in my face. I decided I'd just ignore it and, the next day, walk right past that hallway without looking at the damn door. But then the sound came back. But now it wasn't muffled. It was clear right on the other side of the wall from my apartment. 3 dry knocks. Tap, tap, tap. I stopped breathing. The space behind that wall was exactly where the storage room was. I stood still, unsure whether to go to the door, pretend I hadn't heard anything, or run. Then before I made any decision, the last knock came. Louder, right at head height. I can't explain what happened to me at that moment, but it was as if my body refused to react. I stood there, frozen, hearing my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. Everything inside me screamed to run, but I just couldn't move. And then, the worst happened. After the last knock, the doorknob of the storage room turned. I heard the metallic click and a slight creak, as if someone was trying to open the door from the inside slowly, testing if it was unlocked. My stomach flipped, my hands went cold. I knew the door didn't have a lock on the inside. There was no way anyone was in there. But somehow, there was. I don't remember exactly how. I did it, but when I realized it, I was already leaving the apartment, running down the stairs without looking back. I spent the night at a friend's house and came back the next day, still during the day, with the excuse of picking up some things. The hallway was normal. The storage room door was closed as if it had never been opened. I couldn't stay more than a few minutes inside. I grabbed a backpack with essentials and went straight to talk to the landlord. I asked without hesitation, what was in that room? He just stared at me for a few seconds, as if deciding what to say, then shrugged and said, "That door is always locked." I didn't argue. I grabbed my things that same day and never came back. To this day, when I think about it, I try to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But sometimes I still wonder, if I hadn't closed the door fast enough that night, what would have come out of there? Story 2. I've never been the type to be easily impressed. I've always been more skeptical, one of those people who need to see to believe. But since moving into that apartment with my girlfriend, some things started to bother me. The building was old, but well located and with affordable rent. Perfect for us. The only strange thing was the noise. Right in the first week, we started noticing footsteps coming from the ceiling, like someone walking right above us. At first, we didn't think much of it. We figured it was probably maintenance or, in the worst case, a tenant, with access to the roof. But the footsteps kept coming, always at night, always at the same rhythm. Worse, they came from exactly the same spot, right in the center of our ceiling. After a while, curiosity got the best of me. I went to the building management to ask who had access to the roof, and if it was normal to hear someone walking up there. The doorman looked at me strangely and said there was no access to the roof. The top floor of the building had been closed off years ago after a poorly done renovation, and what was above our ceiling was just an empty attic with no entry. I awkwardly laughed, trying not to seem paranoid, but that answer kept ringing in my head. If no one was up there, then who the hell was walking around every night? That night, I lay in bed already feeling a strange weight on my chest. I wanted to believe the doorman was wrong, that maybe there was some access he didn't know about. But then, just after midnight, the footsteps came back. Tap, tap, tap. Rhythmic, slow, dragging. But this time there was something different. They didn't stop at the same point as always. They began to move, as if they were following the layout of our apartment. My girlfriend noticed too. She nudged me, her eyes wide. "You're hearing this, right?" I just nodded. The footsteps were coming right above our bed. My body tensed, every muscle frozen. Then, they stopped. Right there, on the ceiling, above us. The silence that followed was worse than the noise itself. A heavy, loaded silence, as if something was waiting. I held my breath. It was then that I heard a different sound. A scratch, like something was dragging its nails across the wood of the ceiling, testing. The sound lingered, slowly, as if it were intentional. My heart began pounding so hard it felt like I was going to throw up. I had never been so afraid in my life. I didn't know what to do. My mind tried to find a logical explanation, but my body just wanted to get out of there. Then, out of nowhere, the scratching stopped. For a moment I thought it was over. Maybe it was just a trapped animal in the attic, or wood expanding, anything. But then came the worst sound of all. A dry creak, like wood giving way, followed by a dull thud, like something heavy had fallen on the attic floor, right above us. My girlfriend let out a suffocated scream and jumped out of bed. Story 3. This happened in 2019 when I was on a long road trip for work. I worked as a sales representative and I spent a lot of the month traveling between small towns to visit clients. On this particular day, I had been driving for almost 8 hours, and honestly, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to stop at a roadside motel to rest. It wasn't the worst place I had stayed, but it wasn't exactly the type of place where you felt safe. The sign flickered with a few burnt-out letters. The lobby smelled like old cigarette smoke, and the receptionist, a woman in her 50s with a tired expression, handed me the key without even asking my name. I took my room card and headed straight to the room without much ceremony. The room was exactly what I expected. Stained carpet, worn-out furniture, a vague smell of mildew mixed with cheap cleaning products. But I just wanted to sleep, so I tossed my bag on the armchair and went straight to the bathroom to wash my face. When I came back, I noticed that the TV was on a channel with static noise. Just that low buzzing filling the silence. It bothered me, because I was sure I hadn't turned the TV on. I grabbed the remote and turned it off, trying to ignore that irrational discomfort starting to form at the back of my mind. I threw myself on the bed, and only then did I notice the detail that made me freeze. On the nightstand next to the old phone and the yellowish lamp, there was a small, battered notebook, its cover stained with something that looked like coffee. I stared at it for a while, wondering if I should take it or leave it alone. But curiosity won. I picked up the notebook and flipped through the first pages. It seemed like a journal, but what freaked me out was that the dates were from different years, as if multiple people had written in it over time. At first, the notes were normal, talking about fatigue, long trips, comments on the motel's food. But as I kept reading, the entries began to change. Some pages were scribbled in a hurry, with phrases like, "Don't sleep here. There's someone outside the door. If you hear knocking, don't open." My stomach churned. I slammed the journal shut, feeling my chest tighten. The TV turned on again, by itself. The static filled the room once more, and I jumped up, holding my breath. This time, the volume was louder. I turned it off again, more annoyed than scared. But as soon as I touched the remote, the knock started on the door. Sharp, insistent, tap, tap, tap. My blood ran cold. I hadn't ordered room service, no one knew I was here. The hallway had been empty when I entered. Whoever was knocking knew I was awake. My first instinct was to ignore it. I stood still, holding the TV remote like it was a weapon, listening to the knocking repeat. Tap, tap, tap. Always in the same rhythm, spaced by a few seconds of silence. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my neck. I tried to convince myself it was just a hotel employee, maybe a mix-up at the reception. But for some reason, I knew it wasn't. There was something in that knock that sounded different. Strange, as if the person on the other side wasn't there for a normal reason. The weirdest part, I didn't hear footsteps in the hallway, just the knocks. It was as if someone had already been standing there before everything started. After a while it stopped, but it didn't bring relief. The silence was worse. The kind of silence that makes you realize how alone you are in a strange place with no one to help. My phone was in the bag, on the other side of the room, and I didn't have the courage to walk over there. I sat on the edge of the bed waiting, but nothing happened. No voice from the other side, no shadow under the door. Just the TV, which turned on again. This time it wasn't static. It was on a dark channel, with no image but a muffled sound in the background. It sounded like breathing. My mouth went dry. I turned off the TV without looking, trying to ignore the chill creeping down my back. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera to film the door. I don't know why, maybe to prove to myself I wasn't going crazy. But when I turned the camera to the screen, I saw it. On the screen, the room door was slightly ajar, just a little, enough for someone to look inside. I froze. The door physically was still shut, but on the phone screen it was open. I dropped my phone on the bed and rushed to the door, grabbing the doorknob with all my strength. The mirror in the room reflected my tense silhouette and what should have been the closed door behind me. But when I looked back at the phone, the screen showed the gap widening, as if someone was slowly opening it, right there behind me. I didn't want to turn. I didn't want to see. But fear took over my body in a way I couldn't avoid. I slowly turned my head. The door was still closed. But when I looked at the screen for the last time, there was something in the opening. My whole body froze. On the phone screen, in the reflection of that door that shouldn't be open, I saw something. Not a face, not exactly. It was a shadow. A dark outline, as if someone were standing on the other side, watching me through the gap. But it wasn't normal. The height didn't make sense. It looked like the head was tilted at an odd angle, as if trying to see better inside the room. The image trembled slightly, maybe because of my own fear, but I knew it wasn't a glitch in the camera. I knew there was someone there. My breathing was so heavy, it echoed in my head, but I forced myself to look away from the phone and face the actual door, still closed, locked. I didn't want to be there anymore. I grabbed my stuff without even checking if I was forgetting anything and went straight to the door, but my body froze before I turned the doorknob. What if, when I opened it, that thing was on the other side? A chill ran down my back. I stepped away, breathing deeply, trying to think. My only plan was to wait until dawn, but the idea of spending hours in there, alone with that thing on the other side, made me sick. Then, out of nowhere, the sound came back. Not the knocks, not the TV. It was the sound of the notebook turning a page, by itself. My heart stopped for a second. I slowly turned my face to the nightstand and saw the notebook there, open to a page I hadn't read before. The writing was hurried, shaky, and seemed unfinished, but what I could read made my stomach sink. If you're reading this, it means you also heard. Don't look at the screen. I swallowed hard. The screen. The phone was still in my hand, and my thumb trembled over the lock button. Should I turn it off? Or was it too late? It was then that the bathroom door slammed, as if something was trying to get out of there. I swear to God I hadn't gone into that bathroom since I arrived. The light inside was off. My body reacted before my mind could, and I ran out of the room without thinking. I crossed the empty hallway, ran down the stairs 2 at a time, and didn't stop until I was outside the motel, breathing in the cold night air as if I had just escaped a nightmare. But the nightmare didn't end there, because when I finally turned to look at the building, my window was dark, but the room door was open. My whole body froze, standing there in the parking lot, staring at the door to my room wide open. Even though I knew I had left it shut, I wanted to convince myself that someone from the motel had entered after I ran out, that maybe it was an employee checking the room. But something inside me knew it wasn't that. The door didn't look open in any way. It looked open to me, as if it were waiting for me, as if it knew I was still there, watching. My instincts screamed for me to leave as fast as possible, but at the same time there was an absurd fear of turning my back on that scene. I didn't want to turn my back on it. I didn't want to give whatever it was the chance to get closer. I don't know how long I stood there, but adrenaline forced me to make a decision. I grabbed my phone and called the reception. The phone rang 3 times before a tired voice answered. The same woman who had checked me in before. I tried to speak calmly, but my voice trembled. "There's someone in my room." She took a few seconds to respond, as if processing what I had said. "What's your room number, sir?" I swallowed hard. I didn't know. I hadn't paid attention when I entered. My brain had been so focused on what had happened that I simply didn't remember. And then she said something that made my skin crawl. "Sir, we don't have any guests on the upper floors tonight." My heart stopped. I went silent, gripping the phone tightly. She didn't ask if I was sure. She didn't question whether I was in the right motel. She just said that with absolute certainty, as if she already knew that the room I was in shouldn't have been occupied. And then, without me saying anything else, she finished. "You need to leave. Now." I didn't think twice. I got in the car, threw it in gear without even putting on my seatbelt, and drove out of there as fast as I could. The motel disappeared in the rearview mirror, and only then did I realize my hands were sweaty, gripping the wheel. My chest was still rising and falling too fast, but I knew I had done the only right thing. I left while I still could. The next day I tried to find information about the motel, but found nothing except some old reviews, all talking about bad service and the bad smell in the rooms. Nothing about guests hearing things. Nothing about the notebook. And the strangest thing, the motel didn't exist on Google Maps. It simply didn't show up. I tried retracing the route I took the night before, driving along the same road, but couldn't find the place, as if it had never been there, as if that whole night had never happened. But I still had proof. When I got home and checked my phone, the last video I recorded was still there, and in it, I could clearly see the door of the room slightly ajar, and a shadow on the other side. Story 4. This happened about a year ago, when I was still working as a barista in a small coffee shop, one of those cozy places with yellow lighting and the constant smell of freshly ground coffee. It was a calm place, where I already knew the regular customers. Among them, there was an old man who came every single day, always at the same time. He was tall and thin, with a face marked by time and a lost look, as if he was always hearing something that no one else could hear. The strangest thing about him was that he always used an old Walkman, one of those cassette tape players, and never spoke to anyone. He would sit at the same corner table, drink his coffee slowly, and listen to his tape. We used to joke among the staff that he must have been listening to some hypnotic audio or old recording, because he never changed the tape, never switched devices. It was always the same thing, every day. I never paid much attention to it, until one afternoon after the rush had died down, I noticed he had forgotten the Walkman on the table. I called the manager, and we asked the other customers if anyone knew where he lived, but no one had any idea. The guy came every day but seemed to not exist outside of there. After waiting a while, the manager suggested we leave the device at the counter in case he came back for it. But when the cafe closed, he still hadn't shown up. I was cleaning the tables when I glanced at the Walkman. The tape was still inside. Something inside me felt uneasy, a strange curiosity. I lowered the volume, put the headphones on, and pressed play. What I heard didn't sound like music. It was a low, strange melody, full of background noise, as if it had been recorded from a distant place. It was a sad sound, almost suffocating, that seemed to purposely go out of tune, as if trying to imitate music but failing in a subtle way. I got an immediate chill, but before I could take off the headphones, a different sound appeared on the recording. A voice. It wasn't singing. It was low, distorted, impossible to understand. But I swear it was there, almost like a whisper between the notes. My stomach turned immediately. I jumped back, took off the headphones, and stopped the tape. The silence that followed was worse. The place was already closed, it was just me and the manager finishing up. But suddenly I had a horrible feeling that someone was watching me. I looked around, but the cafe was empty. Then, out of nowhere, the Walkman made a clicking sound and the tape rewound to the beginning. I didn't want to touch it anymore. My heart was racing and my chest felt tight, as if my body had realized something before my mind had understood. The manager called me from the other side of the counter, asking if I had finished closing everything, and I just nodded. I didn't say anything about what had happened because I didn't even know how to explain it, but I didn't want to be alone in that place, so I finished what was left as quickly as I could. When I turned off the lights and grabbed my bag, I glanced at the Walkman again. It was still pressing the play button. Even after I had taken the tape out, I tried to ignore it and left. I walked to the bus stop, trying to forget that awful feeling, but my mind was stuck on that sound, that distorted melody. It was only when I got home that I realized a detail that made me freeze. The tape had no label, no name, no band, nothing. It was just a black tape with no identification. This bothered me so much that the next day I decided to search for that song. I opened Google and tried everything. Typed fragments of the melody, used apps that recognize music, even went into forums for collectors of old tapes. But I found nothing. This gave me a headache. How could that man listen to the same song every day if it simply didn't exist anywhere? I spent the day uneasy, and when I went back to work, my first reaction was to look at the counter. The Walkman was no longer there. I asked the manager, but he said he hadn't seen anyone take it. No employee knew what had happened. But the worst part was that the man never showed up again. That guy who came every day, without fail, simply disappeared. After that day, I never saw him again. Never heard about him. It was as if he had never existed. I tried to forget, move on with my life, but one thing still haunts me to this day. Every now and then, when I'm distracted, that melody comes back to my head. Out of nowhere, without reason, without explanation. As if I had heard more than I should have. As if, somehow, that song is still looking for me. Story 5. When my grandmother passed away, it fell to me to organize her things. My mom couldn't handle it emotionally, and my uncles lived far away, so I was the one left with the boxes of old photos, documents, and family memorabilia. I was never really into that kind of thing, but I thought it would be interesting to look at photos of my grandmother when she was young, of my family. Before I was born, I spent an entire weekend sorting out the best ones to put into albums, but one, in particular, caught my attention. It was a black and white photo from a wedding, probably from the 1950s. What was strange was that when I looked closer, I noticed a figure in the background of the photo, a man in a dark suit, standing a bit away from the other guests. He was staring directly at the camera, but his face seemed a little out of focus, as if it were intentionally blurred. I didn't pay much attention at first, just thought it was curious. I kept sorting the photos, placed a few in frames, and scattered them around my house. Among them, I chose that wedding photo to leave on the shelf, along with other family memories. A few days later, while walking through the living room, I glanced at the photo and felt a strange shiver. The man in the background, he seemed a little closer. I froze, blinked a few times, trying to understand. It couldn't be right. It was the same photo. I must have been tired, my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling that something was different wouldn't leave my head. So, I did something I never do. I went to the boxes and grabbed the original photo, the one I had kept separately. I placed it side by side with the framed one, and my blood froze. In the original photo, the man was far away, almost imperceptible, but in the framed photo, he was closer, as if he had taken a few steps forward. My stomach turned. It didn't make sense. The photos were identical, the same image, taken from the same negative, but one of them had changed. And for the first time in my life, I felt a real, deep fear, the kind that makes you question reality. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was the glass of the frame distorting the image. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. But the more I looked, the less I could deny the obvious. The man in the photo was different. Not only was he closer, but the shadow around him seemed darker, more pronounced, as if it had more clarity than the rest of the photo. I slammed the frame shut and threw it back on the shelf, trying to forget, but the discomfort stayed with me for the rest of the day. When night fell, I ended up checking again. The frame was still there in the same spot, but as soon as I picked up the photo, I noticed something that made me drop it instantly. Now, he was even closer. The man, who had been a distant blur, was now clear enough for me to see the details of his suit, the features of his face, though his eyes were still strangely out of focus. My heart raced. How was this possible? It was the same photo. Was I going crazy? By now I didn't want that thing in my house anymore. I grabbed the photo and ran to the kitchen, hurriedly folding the paper. I threw it in the trash and took a deep breath. Done. It was over. Or so I thought. That night I woke up in the middle of the night with a horrible feeling that I wasn't alone in the room. My whole body went stiff. I lay there listening to the house breathe, until something made me hold my breath. The sound of something sliding across the floor. With my chest tight, I stretched my hand out and turned on the nightstand lamp. I looked around, trying to understand what I had heard. That's when I saw it. The frame was standing on the nightstand next to my bed. I swear to God I had thrown that photo away, but it was there. And the man, now, he was in front of all the other guests, right in the center. The photo. And this time he was staring directly at me. My entire body refused to move. I could only look at that photo, at that man who shouldn't have been there. His face still had that strange lack of focus in his eyes, like smudges. But now, seeing it up close, I noticed another detail. The corners of his mouth were slightly curled upward, as if he were smiling. But it wasn't a normal smile. It was subtle, a half smile, the kind of expression that seems wrong when you stare at it too long. And I stared too long, because for a moment I had the absurd feeling that smile had gotten a little wider. I threw the frame on the floor. The glass shattered, spreading shards all over my bedroom floor. But I didn't want to know. I grabbed the photo with trembling hands and ran back to the kitchen. I wasn't going to throw it in the trash this time. I was going to burn it. I grabbed a lighter, lit one end of the paper, and watched the fire rise slowly, consuming the image. My heart was still racing, but part of me felt relieved to see that man's face being erased by the flames. It was over. That night, I slept with the bedroom door locked and all the lights on. I woke up early the next day, and the first thing I did was go to the trash, just to make sure the photo was burned. It was. All that remained were ashes and a charred piece of the edge of the paper. I tried to convince myself that it had just been my mind playing tricks, a game of light, some bizarre illusion. But still, one thing kept bothering me, something that made me search through the photo box one more time, just to be sure. And that's when I found it. The original photo, the one I had kept separately, was still there. But when I took it out of the envelope, my stomach churned. The man was still in the picture, but now he wasn't in the background anymore. He had moved closer to the other guests, and he was still staring directly at me. Story 6. This happened about 2 years ago, when I finally managed to buy my first house. It wasn't luxurious, but it was an old, spacious house that needed some renovations. I wanted to make it my own, so I spent weeks knocking down walls, replacing floors, and painting rooms. Everything was going fine until the day I decided to tear down a wall that separated the living room from a small storage room at the back. As I removed the plaster, I found something strange inside the structure. A bunch of old, yellowed envelopes shoved between the bricks. At first I thought they were just forgotten letters from a previous resident, but when I opened the first one, I realized they were handwritten messages, all with the same tone of desperation. Some were almost illegible. The words faded by time, but what I could read sent a chill down my spine. Phrases like, "He's in the house," "The nights are getting longer," "I hear footsteps where there should be no one." The worst part was that they all ended abruptly, as if the person had stopped writing in the middle of their thought. I kept opening the envelopes, feeling a strange weight in my chest. Some letters were dated from the 80s, others seemed even older. The handwriting varied, as if different people had written over time, but all of them spoke about the same thing. Someone or something was in the house, something that kept them from sleeping, that made noises behind the walls, that sometimes whispered. My whole body shivered. Until that moment, I had never felt anything wrong in the Cobb house. No strange noises, no bad vibes. But after reading those letters, the atmosphere seemed to change. The silence became heavier, as if something was waiting. And then, while holding the last letter, I heard a sound behind me. A low, dry noise, like someone scratching the wall. My heart raced. The sound came from the wall beside me, right where I had just removed part of the plaster, as if something was inside. I swallowed hard and tried to convince myself it was just a creature, maybe a rat, trapped in the structure. But that scratching, it didn't sound like an animal. It was rhythmic, as if someone was slowly running their nails across the wood. And the worst part? I felt a slight vibration in the wall. I stood frozen for a few seconds, trying to decide what to do. My instinct was to leave, but my mind kept telling me I was just overreacting from reading those letters. I grabbed a flashlight and approached the hole in the wall. The old wood was dark, covered in accumulated dust. I took a deep breath and tapped the structure twice. Knock, knock. The sound echoed softly, and for a moment nothing happened. But then came the reply. 2 knocks exactly the same. Knock, knock, from the inside. My whole body locked up. I wanted to run, leave the house and never come back. But at the same time, I knew something was inside that wall. I grabbed a putty knife and started scraping more of the plaster, widening the hole. Each piece that fell made my heart beat faster. And then, when I finally managed to open a bigger space, my flashlight illuminated something that made me exhale in a trembling whisper. There was a space inside the wall, a small gap between the wood and the bricks. And deep inside, almost invisible in the darkness, there was an eye staring back at me. I fell backward, almost dropping the flashlight. I crawled across the floor until my back hit the other side of the room, never taking my eyes off that crack. The eye stayed there, fixed on me. It didn't blink. It didn't seem to move, but I was absolutely certain it was a human eye. I wanted to scream, but my throat was locked. All I could think was, who was inside my wall? My whole body was trembling. The flashlight still illuminated the crack, and the eye remained there, fixed, unblinking. My chest was rising and falling rapidly, and I tried to find some rational explanation for it, but there was none. There shouldn't have been anyone in the wall. It was impossible. I had lived there for months without noticing anything strange, without hearing any sounds except for the normal ones from an old house. So, who was in there? Terrified, I jumped up and ran to the hallway. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, but stopped before pressing the call button. What was I going to say? That I found an eye inside the wall? That I found old letters talking about something living in the house? They would laugh in my face. My hands were sweaty, and I didn't know what to do. That's when I heard the most horrifying sound of my life. From inside the wall, someone laughed. Not a regular laugh. It was low, drawn out, as if the person were testing their own voice, as if they didn't quite know how to laugh. My blood ran cold. The laugh lasted only a few seconds before stopping abruptly, plunging the house into absolute silence. I didn't wait any longer. I ran outside, got in my car, and left without even locking the door. The next day, I came back with a contractor. I told him I had found a strange space in the structure and wanted to open up the wall for renovations. He began to break the wood, and when we finally managed to open a hole big enough to enter, we saw what was inside. Nothing. The gap between the walls was empty. No signs of anyone. No hole, no passage. Nothing that explained how someone could have been there. But in the corner, thrown on the floor of the rotten wood, there were more letters, and the most recent one was signed by the same name on the house's deed, the previous owner, missing since 1987. Story 7. This happened last year when 3 friends and I decided to rent a cabin through Airbnb for a weekend getaway, away from the city. We wanted a peaceful place, not too far but with nature around. After doing some research, we found a cabin that seemed perfect. Spacious, well-rated, with beautiful pictures. The host responded quickly, was very polite, and confirmed the reservation without issues. We picked up the car on a Friday afternoon and drove to the location, which was about 40 minutes from the nearest town. We arrived early in the evening. The road was deserted with few houses around, and when we finally found the cabin, one thing stood out immediately. The door was unlocked. This made me a little uneasy, but my friends thought the host had left it open for our convenience. We opened the door and entered with our luggage, and that's when the second strange thing happened. The place looked slightly messy, nothing major, but there was a half-full coffee cup in the sink, a jacket thrown on the couch, and the fireplace seemed to have been used recently. We were a bit suspicious but tried not to panic. Maybe the host had come by to check something and left in a hurry. Maybe the previous guest had left late. But as we explored the house, the discomfort grew. The rooms were fine, but the bathroom had a wet towel hanging in the shower, as if someone had just taken a bath. When I looked in the mirror, I noticed there was steam still on the glass, as if hot water had been used only a few minutes before. By this point, everyone was starting to feel uneasy, but we still tried to keep calm. We started unpacking and preparing some food when one of my friends, Matthias, called us from the living room. He was holding a cell phone. Someone left this here. The problem? The cell phone was unlocked, the screen still on. The last message was a WhatsApp notification, but we could only see the beginning. They're here. If you're still in the house, don't make a sound. Immediately, everyone froze. Matthias stood holding the phone with trembling hands, looking at us as if expecting someone to offer a logical explanation. But no one had one. The screen locked by itself, and when he tried to unlock it, he saw that it had a password. The phone belonged to someone who should still be there. We looked at each other, not knowing what to do. The host hadn't mentioned anyone else in the house. Was the last guest still here? Or worse, were they outside waiting to come back? That's when Anna, who was closest to the window, suddenly stepped back. Was the curtain like this before? We looked at where she was pointing and my stomach sank. The living room curtain was slightly open, just a few centimeters, enough for someone to have looked inside. The silence became heavy, almost tangible. I felt a chill run down my spine as if, suddenly, we weren't alone. Matthias, trying to stay calm, suggested we leave and message the host. But when we grabbed our phones, the signal was gone. That's when we heard it. Footsteps upstairs. Slow, precise. They weren't ours. Everyone turned simultaneously to the stairs that led to the bedrooms. The upstairs was dark, and I swear to God I felt the air get heavier. "There's someone here," Anna whispered, her voice trembling. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that the house was just old and made strange noises. But then another sound came. A door creaking upstairs. No one wanted to go up. No one wanted to check. But if we didn't know who was up there, how would we leave without passing by them? My breath became shallow, and for a moment all I thought was, if this person doesn't want us to leave, we're screwed. That's when we heard something else. The front door, but not opening, closing, as if someone had just entered. The sound of the door closing was like a punch to the stomach. Someone was inside the house with us. My body froze. Everyone looked at each other, not knowing what to do, as if we were waiting for one of us to come up with a magic solution. But no one did. Matthias held the found phone tightly, as if that would help, and Anna already had tears in her eyes. I tried to hear any other sound, any clue where that person was. But what came was even worse. From upstairs, a dry noise, a heavy breath, slow, dragging, like someone was standing at the top of the stairs, listening to us. No steps, no rush, just that constant low sound of someone breathing too slowly. My heart was beating so hard I thought I would faint. And then, without warning, the phone in Matthias's hand vibrated. Everyone jumped back. The screen lit up. A new message. It was from the same unknown contact. Matthias looked at the screen with trembling hands and read aloud, softly, "Run." And it was as if that word broke something inside of us. Anna was the first to move, practically jumping to the door. Matthias and I followed right behind. We didn't think. We didn't look back. We ran as if our lives depended on it. Because in that moment, I really thought they did. When we got outside, the night was cold and silent. The car parked a few meters away. But as we unlocked the doors, we heard the final sound coming from the house. The stairs creaking, as if someone was coming down. No one looked back. No one wanted to see who, or what, was coming down. We ran to the car, threw ourselves inside, and Matthias slammed the door so hard it echoed through the empty road. The key was already in the ignition, and he turned it so fast the engine almost stalled. When the headlights lit up in front of the house, we saw the front door slightly open. It wasn't like that when we left. Anna started crying softly in the back seat, and all I could do was repeat, almost in a whisper, "Accelerate, accelerate, accelerate." The car roared to life, throwing gravel behind us, and we drove away from that dirt road without looking in the rearview mirror. No one said anything for several minutes. I felt the blood pounding in my head, my hands sweating on my lap, and I could only think, what if we had stayed just a few more seconds? What if we hadn't run? I don't know. I don't want to know. All I know is, when we finally got cell service again, Matthias tried calling the host. The call went straight to voicemail. The next day, already safe at home, we tried to find the cabin's listing on Airbnb again. It no longer existed. No reservation, no history, nothing. As if it had never been there. We searched Google Maps, looked at satellite images, anything that could prove we hadn't imagined it. But what we found made my stomach drop. That house had been abandoned for years. The last record of residence was a family that disappeared in the 90s. To this day, we don't know who received us, who sent that message, or who was in the house that night. We only know that if we had stayed just a little longer, maybe we wouldn't be here to tell this story. Story 8. This happened about 6 months ago, when I worked the night shift at a small office downtown. My job was basically to monitor the security system and make sure no one broke into the building after hours. It wasn't a busy place, and after midnight, It was practically deserted. I spent the hours watching the live security footage, drinking coffee, and trying not to fall asleep before the shift was over. Nothing ever happened, until that night. Around 2 a.m., I got a notification from the system. Movement. Detected at the front entrance. That immediately put me on alert, because the building closed at 10 p.m., and no one, besides me, should have been there. I looked at the monitor, expecting to see something obvious, like a cat passing by or a car reflecting light on the sensors. But the screen just showed the empty lobby. No open doors, no strange shadows, nothing. I thought it was a system glitch, so I ignored it and went back to my coffee. But about 15 minutes later, another notification popped up. Movement detected in the lobby. This time, I went straight to the monitor and my heart skipped a beat. There was someone there, a figure standing in the middle of the lobby, with their back to the camera. They were tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. But what chilled me was the way they were standing, rigid, motionless, as if they were waiting for something. I should have called building security immediately, but I stayed there, mesmerized by the screen, waiting for the person to move. But they didn't move, not even a little. For a moment I thought the camera had frozen. Then suddenly the person's head tilted slightly to the side. Not the body, just the head. Enough for me to feel with absolute certainty that they knew I was watching. A cold shiver ran down my spine. My first instinct was to check the other cameras to get a better angle, but the system started to fail. The images became grainy, cutting to static for a few seconds before returning to normal. When the screen stabilized, the figure was no longer in the lobby. It had simply vanished. My stomach dropped. There was no way they could have left without passing by some other camera, but they didn't show up in any of them. I grabbed the phone to call security, but before I could dial, another notification appeared on the screen. Movement detected on the 3rd floor. My blood ran cold. The 3rd floor was right below where I was. And worse, there were no working stairs or elevators in that part of the building. It was a vacant floor under renovation with no one there. My heart began to race. If the person was on the 3rd floor, how did they get there? I opened the corresponding camera and held my breath. At first, the image seemed normal, but then I noticed something that made me break out in a cold sweat. At the end of the hallway near the emergency exit door, there was a strange shadow on the floor. Small, elongated, as if someone was standing out of the camera's reach, but close enough to cast a shadow. My chest tightened. I knew with complete certainty that someone was there. Suddenly the shadow moved. Not like a person walking. It was a jerky movement, almost like a spasm. And then, the camera shut off by itself. The screen went black. The system completely froze. And the intercom in my office rang. The intercom's ring was unnervingly loud in the silence of the office. Someone was trying to talk to me. My hand trembled as I pressed the button to answer. Security? My voice came out weaker than I wanted. Silence. No response. Just a low, distant sound, like breathing. Cold, irregular, as if someone was very close to the microphone. My whole body went cold. Who's there? I asked, trying to sound firm. Nothing. Just the breathing, slow and drawn out. Then the call dropped. I felt an overwhelming sense of panic. I didn't know whether to run, call for help, or stay locked in until dawn. But before I could decide, the camera system came back, online by itself. The screens flickered, static covered the image for a few seconds, and then the feed from the 3rd floor hallway reappeared. And this time the figure was there, right in the middle of the hallway, staring directly at the camera. My breath caught. It didn't move, didn't blink, but I had the worst feeling of my life in that moment. It knew I was watching. And the worst part? It seemed to know exactly where I was. That's when it took the first step, slowly, moving toward the stairs. The stairs that led directly to the floor I was on. My body reacted before my mind did. I ran. I grabbed my phone, my office keys, and bolted down the hallway. I wasn't going to wait to see who or what this thing was. I needed to get out of there. But as I ran, I heard something behind me. The sound of footsteps coming from the stairs, fast, climbing. The sound of those footsteps was enough to make me run even faster. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see. I didn't want to know how close it was. The hallway seemed longer than ever, and the elevator was out of the question. I wasn't going to trap myself in a confined space. The only exit was the emergency exit at the end of the hall. I just needed to get there. But the footsteps behind me kept getting faster. The air burned in my throat when I finally reached the exit door. I pushed with all my strength. The door slammed against the wall with a crash, and I started running down the stairs as fast as I could. The echo of my own steps mixed with the sound of the footsteps behind me, but mine were hurried, and theirs, slow, calculated, like they weren't in a rush, like they knew I had nowhere to run. When I reached the ground floor, I sprinted across the lobby, already feeling the relief of being close to the front door. But as soon as I got close, I stopped abruptly. The glass door reflected the lobby behind me, and I saw it. There was someone standing on the stairs, not on the floor above, but right behind me, just a few feet away. My stomach twisted. It was too close, but I didn't hear any more footsteps. It hadn't run. It had simply appeared there. I didn't wait any longer. I slammed the door with all my might and ran into the street. The cold night air hit my face, but I didn't stop until I reached the other side of the road. I looked back. The lobby was empty. There was no one there, but the reception camera flickered, as if it was rebooting, as if the whole system had been reset. And that's when I realized maybe it wasn't trying to catch me. Maybe it just wanted me to know it was there. Story 9. Last year, when I moved into a small apartment in the city center, I started buying furniture and decor from thrift stores to save money. I've always liked these stores because you can find good things at a low price, and that's how I found the mirror. It was large, old, with a dark wooden frame full of intricate carvings. It was leaning in a corner of the store, covered by a thin cloth. When I asked the price, the shop owner hesitated a little before saying it. He seemed bothered. He said he could sell it to me cheaply, as long as at the time I thought it was strange, but I accepted. I put the mirror in the car and took it home. It was leaning against the wall in the living room, not hanging because I still didn't have enough nails. At first, I thought it added an elegant touch to the apartment, but after a few days, I started to feel a slight discomfort every time I passed by. As if something was wrong. The reflection seemed normal, but every time I glanced at it, on the third day, I noticed a detail that made me shiver. Every time I passed by the mirror, I had the feeling that the reflection took about half a second longer to catch up with me. It was subtle, something you only notice when you start paying attention. I moved quickly from one side to the other, and the reflection was there, but something about the timing was slightly off. My brain tried to convince me that it was just in my head, but then, one night after getting home late from work, I passed by the mirror again and suddenly stopped. Something was different. The apartment behind me seemed a little darker in the reflection than in reality. The shadows were deeper, and the worst part, the curtains behind me were closed, but in the reflection, they were open. My body froze instantly. I slowly turned my head to check the real curtains. Closed, but in the reflection, they were still open. This didn't make sense. My heart started to beat faster, and I felt that strange chill run up my back. I blinked a few times, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the reflection was still wrong. The room in the mirror seemed misaligned with mine. The objects were I didn't want to look anymore, but at the same time I couldn't take my eyes off it. Then, I did the worst thing possible. I slowly approached the mirror. The image seemed darker than before, as if the glass was deeper than a normal mirror. My own reflection was there, standing still with the same tense expression. But when I raised my hand to touch the surface, my reflection didn't move at the same time. My heart stopped for a second. Was it just a delay? I tried again, moving my fingers, and this time it followed. But there was still a slight delay, as if something there was trying to imitate my movements, but not perfectly. My breathing became heavier, and then, the moment I tried to pull away, the reflection smiled. I didn't smile, but it did. A small, wrong smile that lasted only a second before disappearing. I screamed and stumbled backward, almost knocking over a chair. And the exact moment I looked away, I heard a muffled sound from the other side of the glass, like a light tap. as if someone had knocked on the mirror, and from the inside, my whole body was shaking. The room seemed darker, the air heavier, as if something had changed after that moment. I backed away from the mirror, stumbling, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to look at it anymore, but at the same time, the worst possible feeling took over me. The feeling that I wasn't alone in there. Something in the apartment seemed different, as if the very atmosphere had changed. I grabbed my phone and started researching old mirrors, trying to find any logical explanation. I found forums and disturbing stories about objects that carry bad energy, mirrors used in rituals, and even stories of reflections that move on their own. My mind tried to rationalize, but my instinct screamed that I needed to get that thing out of there. But before I could take any action, something changed on my phone's screen. My peripheral vision caught a movement. On the screen, in the reflection of the mirror, I froze. My heart felt like it stopped beating. In the reflection of the phone, I saw the room behind me, but the problem was that I wasn't alone anymore. In the corner of the reflection, near the frame of the mirror, there was something standing. Something dark, tall, standing there, inside the reflection. My breathing caught in my throat. My body froze. I didn't want to turn. I knew that if I looked directly at the mirror, I would see it there. The problem? In real life, the corner of the mirror was empty, but in the reflection, someone was watching me. I couldn't breathe properly. My body was paralyzed, holding the phone as if it would protect me from something. I wanted to turn off the screen, close my eyes, but at the same time I couldn't stop looking. The reflection was still there, and the thing in the mirror was still standing, just staring. But then, something worse happened. It started to move. It was subtle at first, a slight tilt of the head. Then a step forward, still in the reflection, as if testing the proximity. The blood froze in my veins. In real life, the mirror was still empty, but on the phone, someone inside the reflection was getting closer. My instinct finally broke the trance and made me act. I covered the mirror with a sheet without looking directly at it and dragged it to the door of the room. I wanted that thing out of my house. I grabbed the frame carefully and took it to the alley behind the building. My arms were shaking, but I managed to lean it against a dirty wall. After that, I ran back to my apartment, locked all the doors and sat on the couch, trying to process everything. The apartment felt lighter, as if that presence had left with the mirror. But before trying to sleep, I gathered the courage to open the door and take one last look at the street. The mirror wasn't there anymore. To this day, I don't know what happened. If someone took it, if the mirror itself disappeared, or if what was inside it finally left. I never went back to that thrift store, and if I see an old mirror anywhere, I pass right by it. I never want to feel that sensation again. I never want to ask myself if the reflection in the glass is just imitating Benici, or if it's waiting for the right moment to do something different. Story 10. Last year, I had to move into a smaller apartment after a complicated divorce. I wanted a quiet, inexpensive place, and I ended up finding an old building in the city center. Nothing too modern, but the rent fit my budget, and the neighborhood was quiet at night. Right in the first week, I met my neighbor next door, a lady named Donna Lucia. She must have been in her early 70s with very pale skin, white hair tied in a tight bun, and those ever-watchful eyes as if she were always studying every detail around her. She was kind, but she had a needy way about her. She would always strike up conversations in the hallway, ask about my day, and seemed to like it when I stopped to listen to her stories. She told me she had lived there for over 40 years and had seen many neighbors come and go. She always repeated that people didn't stay long in that building. I thought it was just old people talk, and to be honest, I felt a certain relief to have such a friendly neighbor in such an empty building. One day, while coming back from the store, I passed in front of her door and saw that it was slightly ajar. I found it odd because Donna Lucia was the kind of person who always double-checked the lock before entering. I knocked on the door, calling for her. No response. I waited a few seconds, peeking through the crack. The apartment was dark, with just a faint light from the kitchen illuminating part of the living room. The couch had a faded fabric and some old photos were on the table, but the place seemed empty. A fine layer of dust covered the furniture, as if no one had touched it for a long time. I had a bad feeling. I slowly closed the door and went back to my apartment. thinking maybe she had left and forgotten to lock up. But when I entered, I saw a detail that made me freeze. On my kitchen table there was a book, the same book Donna Lucia had lent me a few days ago. I was sure it had been on my shelf, but now it was there, open, on the last page, and on it, there was a handwritten note. "Don't forget to return it to me." Right then a chill ran down my back. I knew I hadn't put that book there. I hadn't even finished reading it. I picked up the book with trembling hands and flipped through the pages, trying to find some logical explanation. But the note on the last page was there, written in thin, slightly shaky handwriting. It was hers. I slammed the book, shut and tried to ignore the bad feeling, convincing myself that I must have taken the book earlier and forgotten. But something inside me already knew that wasn't it. The next morning, I decided to return the book to Donna Lucia. I walked to her door and knocked several times. Nothing. I waited a little and knocked again, calling her name. The hallway was strangely silent, as if the entire building were listening. After a while, the neighbor across the hall opened his door, looking at me with confusion. "Who are you calling?" he asked. "Donna Lucia from 304. Do you know if she left?" The man looked at me for a while, as if trying to understand if I was joking. Then he gave a small, nervous laugh and shook his head. "Man, that apartment's been empty for years." My mouth went dry instantly. It couldn't be. I had spoken with Donna Lucia last week. She lent me the book. I saw that woman every day. I tried to laugh, thinking the guy was messing with me, but he just stood there, looking at me like he pitied me. Seriously, man, that apartment's been empty since before I moved in. The owner tried renting it a few times, but no one stayed long. My heart began to pound. This didn't make sense. The open door, the book on my table, the conversations in the hallway. Everything felt so real. I looked at the 304 door, clenched my fists, and before I could think, I twisted the doorknob. The door opened. The neighbor stepped back. "Hey man, you can't go in there," he said. But my mind was already far away. I had to see with my own eyes. The apartment was completely empty. Not only was it without furniture, but it had that smell of an abandoned place, dust piled in the corners, and marks of old pictures on the walls. There was no couch, no photos on the table, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. The floor creaked under my feet as I walked slowly to the middle of the room. All that remained were some old boxes stacked in the corner, and in the middle of them a fallen frame on the floor. I crouched down slowly and turned the frame. It was an old black and white photo, yellowed with time. My eyes quickly scanned the people smiling for the camera until I saw her. Donna Lucia, younger, with the same tight bun and that attentive look. My stomach dropped. The bottom of the photo was torn, but you could see that a name had been written there, in shaky, elderly handwriting. Lucia S., 1952, 1989. My vision blurred for a moment. 1989. My head was spinning, trying to piece it together, but nothing made sense. If this was the same Donna Lucia I spoke to in the hallway, how could she have been dead for over 30 years? I stood up slowly, holding the frame tightly, trying to process it. The neighbor was still standing at the door, looking at me with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. I talked to her. "I swear to you." My voice came out weaker than I expected. He frowned and took a step back. "If you say so, man. But this place has been empty for a while. I think you should leave." And for the first time, I agreed. I needed to get out of there. I placed the frame back on the floor and left the apartment, closing the door behind me, as if it could bury that suffocating feeling growing inside my chest. I tried to forget about it in the following days, convincing myself I had imagined everything. Maybe I had confused the dates. Maybe Donna Lucia was a relative of the woman in the photo. But deep down, I knew this was just an excuse my mind was creating so I could sleep at night. But then, 2 days later, I received an envelope under my door. No sender. Nothing written on the outside. My chest tightened. I grabbed the envelope with sweaty hands and carefully opened it. Inside was just a torn piece of paper from a book. The book she had lent me. At the bottom of the page, written with the same shaky handwriting from the photo, there was one last message. "Thank you for the company.